Great. All right, let's do it. So if you have your word, we are in 2 Samuel. We are more than halfway through the book now. You know, we've gotten through we're in the whole book of 2 Samuel is the reign of King David, right? So as we're looking at 2 Samuel, we've seen David come to the zenith or pinnacle of his kingdom, but we've already seen well more than that, because David began to really fall into sin. And it's interesting that David never struggled with the sins of what you'd consider like the outside sins, right? Of like dealing with the enemies of God. Like he didn't really struggle with the world, right? The scripture just defines our enemies today as the world, the flesh, and the devil, right? And David, you don't really see too many places where David struggles with the world or the enemies of God, people that are unbelievers, idolaters, but he struggled with the flesh a lot. And so we saw back in chapters 11 and 12, we saw David's great sin with Bathsheba. Some of us just got to go see the play of David at Sight and Sound, and that's pretty awesome. Jealous. But they covered a lot of that. David's sin with Bathsheba, and then that's where it really got kicked off. And then he followed on with the sins of murdering Uriah and trying to cover it up, which didn't work, right? And so we saw all of that. And then the last time we were together, when we did chapters 13, 14, and 15, it was really the first half of the story of Absalom, okay? David's son, Absalom. These are all adult sons. David's got many adult sons, Nathan, Solomon, Absalom here, Amnon, we looked at. And we set up chapter 11, 12, and 13. No, I'm sorry, chapters 13, 14, and 15 as the first half of the story of Amnon. Okay, in fact, that's what we called it. We called those chapters Absalom Part 1, and we looked at sins of omission. But it really wasn't it really wasn't Absalom's sins of omission, it was David's. And so, although those three chapters are now tonight in chapters 16, 17, and 18, this is the second half of the story of Absalom, the interesting thing is there is a lot more application to be drawn out of David and what he did or didn't do through all 6 of these chapters. And so we set up the first half looking at all of the things that David didn't do. He didn't correct his sons. He didn't deal with Amnon's rape of his sister. He didn't deal with Absalom's rebellion and bitterness and murder in his heart of hating his brother and wanting to usurp David's throne. And so when we were at the end of chapter 15, we saw that Absalom actually grew in power to the extent that he was able to drive David from the throne. If you remember, Absalom went down to Hebron and he had a bunch of men with him and they declared Absalom king, and David got wind of this and David's had to flee. So at the end of chapter 15, halfway through the story of Absalom, that's really where it's at. Absalom is marching to the capital and David is fleeing for his life towards the east. He went over the Kidron Valley, or the brook Kidron. He went over now the Mount of Olives, right, where Jesus went, praying in the garden. And now David is fleeing towards the east. And that's kind of where the story picks up here in chapter 16 tonight. So we saw all of these sins of omission, things that David didn't do that he should have done to correct his sons. And we talked extensively about why is it that maybe David didn't correct his sons. And I believe a lot of the reason is because David struggled in these same areas of the lust of the flesh. David struggled with a lot of these same sins, so he never corrected his sons in these things. We made a big point last week of saying that if you wait until you have perfectly, fully, 100% conquered a sin to teach others to steer clear of it, you've missed it. Because even in struggling with something, and sometimes that's even a better time, to help and encourage and instruct somebody, don't do this. Show them the scars and say, this is what it's brought me. Don't do this. And so the second half here tonight of the story of Absalom, with the first half being the sins of David's sins of omission, the second half, we're kind of setting this up with the idea of carried through by loyalty. Now, David's on the run from Absalom. He's really suffering in a lot of ways the results of his own sin in not dealing with Amnon and now Absalom, who has usurped his throne. And the idea of carried through by loyalty, because in these chapters tonight, we're going to see a lot of people coming in and out of the story and how they decide to side with either David or Absalom. And there's so many people talked about and introduced and that we deal with that it's a great opportunity to look at how did they choose who they were going to be loyal to and how, and even the methods of how they're going to do it. So it's a lot about loyalty. Don't we need somebody to carry us through the hard times that's loyal? We're looking for people that are loyal, that not just in the good times where you have things you can offer them, but in the hard times, they're going to be there. They're going to be available. And we're looking for that in David's life right now as he's on the run. So we're going to look at a couple of parts of how loyalty works here for David in these chapters. And we're going to start in chapter 16. And we'll be introduced to many, many different people. And some of them we were just recently introduced. But to break down loyalty here in these 3 chapters, the first part of this I want you to see is its motivations. What motivates people to either be loyal or not? Because some of the people we see here in chapter 16 are not loyal to David. And we'll see what drove them to not be loyal to David. So let's start off here in chapter 16, verse 1. And when David was a little past the top of the hill, this is the Mount of Olives, okay? Behold, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, met him with a couple of donkeys saddled, and upon them was 200 loaves of bread and 100 bunches of raisins and 100 of summer fruits and a bottle of wine. And the king said to Ziba, what meaneth these? And Ziba said, these asses are for your household, David, to ride on, and the bread and the summer fruit for the young men to eat, and the wine that such as be faint in the wilderness may drink. And the king said, and where is your master's son? He's talking about Mephibosheth, right? Now remember, Mephibosheth is Saul's grandson. This is Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth. This is the man that David helped out. When David took the throne, he wanted to make sure that Saul's family, specifically Jonathan's family under him, was taken care of. And so David showed a lot of grace to Mephibosheth, and he had this servant of Saul's, Ziba, make sure, it was Ziba's job to make sure this lame man, Mephibosheth, would always be taken care of. So Ziba comes to David with all of this food, as if Ziba's going to be loyal and side with David. But David says to him in verse 3, where is Mephibosheth? And Ziba said to the king, well, behold, he abides at Jerusalem. For he said, today shall the house of Israel be restored unto the kingdom of my father. So Ziba tells David that Mephibosheth is expecting to take the throne. That's Ziba's story. Little hint, it's not true. It's a lie. Ziba's lying. Verse 4, then said the king to Ziba, behold, thine are all that pertaineth unto Mephibosheth. And Ziba said, I humbly beseech thee that I may find grace in thy sight, O Lord my king. And so the story of Ziba here, it will actually be picked up again in chapter 19. So this Ziba and Mephibosheth, remember the story began, like I said, that Mephibosheth was shown grace by David, and Ziba was set up to be the one sort of as the runner of the household. He ran the household. And now David here, because of Ziba's story, that's a fiction, it's a lie, because of Ziba's story saying that Mephibosheth is going to betray David, David says in verse 4 to Ziba, okay, everything that I gave to Mephibosheth, it's now yours. It now belongs to you. All the land, all the houses that belonged to Saul and Jonathan and Mephibosheth, now it's yours. I give it to you. And all based on a lie. David's being a little bit, what's it called, snappy here, a little, not quick-tempered, but he's making snap decisions with not very much information. Now Ziba, on the other hand, is this loyalty to David? No, this is opportunism. I mean, this is kind of the idea. You ever heard the expression, don't ever let a good crisis go to waste? Ziba's like, I know what I can get out of this. If I go out to David right now and lie about Ziba, I can get all the property, all the houses, they could be mine. And so think of Mephibosheth here and think of Ziba here. Ziba is motivated by just self-gain. Self-gain, he's like, I can get something out of this. If I go out and act like I'm loyal to David, I can get David to give me stuff. And then Mephibosheth, on the other hand, he never said any of these things. Mephibosheth is this innocent lame man in the background. We're going to pick up his story later, but just flip over for just a second to chapter 19, just one verse over here. I just want you to see chapter 19, verse 30. When we finally get a confrontation between David and Mephibosheth, this is what Mephibosheth is going to say to David. In chapter 19, verse 30, Mephibosheth said unto the king, Mephibosheth just found out that David gave all of the lands and stuff away to Ziba. And so Mephibosheth says in verse 30 to David, yea, let him take it all, for as much as my lord the king is come again in peace and unto his own house. That is loyalty. That's Mephibosheth saying, look, I don't even want the houses. I don't even need the land. David is back in Jerusalem, and I am excited to have relationship with David again. Do you see Christianity in the Old Testament? Because if you don't, you need to find it right there. Okay? It's the Mephibosheth, the one that's already found grace in the eyes of Jesus Christ, the one that's already experienced a reward that he couldn't earn. And now he finds out that some of those blessings were stripped away from lies. And he's like, I don't even care about any of the stuff. I don't even care about the things that were blessed to me. I just want the blesser. I just want to be back in relationship with God. I just want to be back in relationship with David. That's Mephibosheth. That's loyalty. That's loyalty. He's not loyal to David's blessings. He's loyal to David. And we're going to see more of Mephibosheth later. And Ziba right here in chapter 16 is the exact opposite. Ziba is just this opportunist that says, oh, this is a good opportunity. David's weak. David's confused. He's on the run. I can get something out of this. What a scoundrel. There's no loyalty there at all. He's just taking advantage of David. And now we pick it up in verse 5, and we get another character that we've never met before here. In verse 5, when King David came to Bahurim, behold, there came out a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. He came out and he cursed still as he was coming. He's mad. And he cast stones at David and all of the servants of King David, and all the people and all the mighty men were on his right hand and on his left. And thus said Shimei when he cursed, come out, O thy bloody man, and thou man of Belial, or worthless man. He's just railing at David. In verse 8, the Lord has returned upon, this is still Shimei talking in verse 8, the Lord has returned upon thee all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose stead you are reigning. And the Lord has delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom thy son, and behold, you are taken in thy mischief, because you're a bloody man. Shimei's mad. He is mad. And remember, he's of the house of Saul. So he has this bitterness he's never really dealt with the fact that was God's will, to have David take the throne and Saul's family line go away. That was God's will to have that happen. But Shimei here wrongly thinks that God is moving against David here in a permanent way to take the throne away from him. Shimei is not correct in believing that. And did you notice there in verse 8, Shimei is bringing the Lord into this, right? That's dangerous, to invoke the Lord's name and saying, I know what's happening here. The Lord is doing this to you. Whew, you better be right when you're saying that, or else you're in danger of the judgment. So don't bring the Lord into something unless you know the Lord's will and the Lord's mind. And how do you know the Lord's will and the Lord's mind? By knowing the Word of God. And the more you come to know the Word of God, the more you will know His will and what is right and what is wrong. So Shimei here, you just think of his motivation. And certainly Shimei is not loyal to David. We're not trying to say that Shimei is loyal to David, but he's not. He's actually against David. And why? Why is he against David? Well, he's motivated by emotion. He's erratic and just being driven by his emotion. He's being led into snap decisions like Shimei is doing here, and it's not thought through. I mean, David happens to be walking by where Shimei is, and Shimei is like, there he is. And he just starts railing on him. And I want you to see how David reacts to this starting in verse 9 here. It says, then said Abishai, who was one of David's generals, right? Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over, I pray thee, and take off his head. And David the king said, what have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? So let him curse, because the Lord has said unto him, curse David. Who shall then say, why have you done this? David's saying, look, maybe the Lord told him to curse me. I don't know. David says, I don't know. Maybe he's doing this at the Lord's will. In verse 11, David said to Abishai and to all his servants, behold, my son, which came forth out of my bowels, seeks my life. How much more now may this Benjamite, he's talking about Shimei, do it? Let him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has bidden him. It may be that the Lord will look on mine affliction, and the Lord will requite me good for his cursing this day. And as David and his men went by the way, Shimei went along on the hillside over against him, and he cursed him as he went, and he threw stones at him, and he cast dust. And the king and all the people that were with him came weary, and they refreshed themselves there. So David refrained his men from attacking Shimei. He's like, look, maybe the Lord's put him up to this. We don't know. And that's good counsel. He doesn't know if this is the Lord's will for him to be chastised in this way or not. So David just tells his men, let him alone. I think there's a certain wisdom in the idea that when somebody is disagreeing with you, when somebody takes a position different than you, the first thing we should think, and we heard this a lot in Maine. Pastor Russ Bonin used to say this all the time. When somebody is saying something you don't want to hear, your first reaction should be to say, are they right? Is there something about what they're saying that's right? And we should strive to make that our initial question. Well, wait, maybe there's something here that Shimei is saying that is right, that I need to listen to. So don't just immediately say, oh, they hate me, so therefore everything they say is just absolutely wrong. No, the first thing David says here is, well, just let him alone. Maybe there's something about what he's doing that is right and accurate. So listen to your critics. There might be an ounce of truth in there that we have to listen to. And ironically, the funny thing is here, though, he's claiming that David is a bloody man, right? If David truly was a bloody man, he'd take his head off right now. He wouldn't let Shimei live through this. But he does. He does. We're going to find out the resolution of this story later. So continuing here in verse 15. In verse 15, Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, they came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. So you remember that was one of David's counselors that has betrayed David and stayed there with Absalom to be the counselor to now King Absalom. And in verse 16, it came to pass that when Hushai the Archite, who's David's friend, was come into Absalom, that Hushai said unto Absalom, it's interesting here in verse 16, it says, God save the king, God save the king. You will only find that in the King James English, because it doesn't say God save. That's very English, isn't it? God save the king. It actually, in the Hebrew original, it says something more like, may the king live forever. Okay, God save the king. It's very English. But this Hushai, if you remember, we saw Hushai earlier. He was out with David, and David said, look, you go back. You can get into the palace where Absalom is, and you can hopefully influence things from there. And so here we find Hushai doing exactly that. He's going back to the palace, and he's presenting himself for service in Absalom's court. In verse 17, Absalom said to Hushai, is this your kindness to your friend David? He's meaning David. Why did you not go with your friend David? And in verse 18, Hushai said to Absalom, no, but whom the Lord and his people and all the men of Israel choose, his will I be, and with him will I abide. And again, whom shall I serve? Shall I not serve in the presence of his son, as I have served in thy father's presence? So will I be in thy presence. So Hushai convinces Solomon here to allow him to not just be in the palace, but even to continue as accepted royal advisor. And so interesting here that we have this man Hushai. You know, we've already seen different people and the way they're using different tactics to either show their loyalty or show their betrayal. And now here we have Hushai, who's taking quite a chance because he's loyal to David and he's willing to, he's motivated by godly means, by a godly motivation to serve David and to serve Jesus through all of the right, because he knows that God chose David to be the king, right? And so Hushai here is wanting to help David by peaceful means. Not everybody's gifted that way, to show their loyalty in such a way, kind of covertly, peacefully. I'm going to try to help, a little bit on the down low. But Hushai, you're going to see, he's the thinking man's man. He's not, this army general. He's an intellectual. And he's the one that's sort of trying to be loyal by using his brain to help. He's the tactician, the strategist, trying to help show his loyalty by planning and all of those things. And so just keep that in mind, that to show your loyalty, God will still have you. Use your personality. Maybe you're the bronze of the job, and you got the muscle. Maybe you're the brains of the job. Or many different ways to show your loyalty. Use the gifts that God's given you to be on God's side. And that's what Hushai is doing. He's using his brain. And he knows that he can be used in that way, and he's gonna take the advantage. And so now in verse 20 here, then said Absalom to Ahithophel. Remember, this is the other older man, Ahithophel. He's one of the wise counselors. It says in other writings that Ahithophel was looked at that as when he spoke, it was as if God spoke. That's the way the people of Israel treated him. Now, certainly as biblical Christians, we would never treat the word of a man equal with the word of God. We know that. But this is the reputation that Ahithophel had. He's an older man by this point, and he has this reputation that when he gives a strategy or when Ahithophel gives a plan, it's the right answer. And so in verse 20 here, it says that Absalom, then said Absalom to Ahithophel, give counsel among you what we should do. And Ahithophel said unto Absalom, this is what you should do. You should go in unto your father's concubines, which he hath left here to keep the house. And all Israel shall hear that you are abhorred in your father's eyes. Then shall the hands of all that are with you be strong. So they spread Absalom a tent upon the top of the household, and Absalom went in unto his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now, that just means it was on the rooftop. Okay, they put up a private tent on the rooftop so that it would be clear that that's what it was for him to get together with these concubines. And verse 23, and the counsel of Ahithophel, which he counseled in those days, was as if a man had inquired at the oracle of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel, both to David and now, at this time, with Absalom. So Absalom is seeking to strengthen the kingdom now that he's physically in Jerusalem. And Ahithophel gives this counsel that, look, if you go in and you take these women to yourself, that will strengthen your position. That will prove to any holdouts that you are against the old king and you are your own king. And that's what he does. And so you think of this Ahithophel, and he's really just motivated by his own pride. At this stage and age of his life, he just wants his way. He wants to be seen as the smartest guy in the room. He wants to be known as the guy that's got it all figured out. And so whether it leads to war like this or not, it doesn't matter to him. He wants everybody to know that it was my ideas that won the day. And so we go to chapter 17 here, 2 Samuel 17, and we're going to get to the next one. So notice in chapter 16, there's so many different things that could motivate people to either show their loyalty or to show their betrayal, right? And it comes out in so many different ways. I mean, you're either interested in self-gain or you're interested in a relationship. If you're interested in a relationship, that's loyalty, right? You're either interested in helping the godly or you're not. You're either interested in your own pride or you're not. And so all of these things, all these different people motivated in different ways. And now in chapter 17, we look at a different aspect of the loyalty different people are showing now. And I want to look at the different methods that people can use. Because what does it look like when you show your loyalty? It can look very, very different. And again, we're going to see many different people here in chapter 17. I want you to see how they support or not support David in a very tactical, practical, tangible way. Okay? So if chapter 16 was sort of like the spiritual, mental component of what would drive somebody to loyalty or not, chapter 17 is that very practical expression of loyalty. If you want to show your loyalty to somebody, how do you practically do that? What does it look like? Okay? So that's chapter 17. Take a look at all of these different methods of how people show their loyalty. It's starting in verse 1 of chapter 17 here in 2 Samuel. Moreover, Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Let me now choose out 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue after David this night." Now, this whole chapter 17 is one big thought. It's a plan of Ahithophel, and something's going to intervene. The whole chapter is sort of this one idea, like, hey, should we pursue after David or should we not? And Ahithophel here in verse 1 says, I tell you what, Absalom, let me get a plan together here. Let me get a bunch of men, and we're going to go after David now. That's Ahithophel's plan. Verse 2, it came upon him. No, excuse me. Ahithophel is continuing to explain his plan here in verse 2, and he says, "And I will come upon David while he is weary and weak-handed." Weak-handed means he doesn't have very many men that have come to him yet to help. "And I will make him afraid, and all the people that are with him shall flee. And I will smite the king only, and I will bring back all the people unto you, Absalom. And the man whom you seek is as if all returned. So all the people shall be at peace." And the saying pleased Absalom well, and all the elders of Israel. Can't you just see Absalom on the throne, and Ahithophel comes to him and says, I tell you what, I got a plan. This is how we can finish this thing. And Ahithophel lays out this plan. Look, David is weak. He's still running. There's still people all over Israel that would side with David, but they haven't found him yet. David still doesn't have very many men. We need to go after David now and finish this. And this is Ahithophel's plan, to do this. But there's somebody that's loyal to David that steps up in verse 5. Then said Absalom, "Call now Hushai the Archite also, and let him hear likewise let me hear what he has to say." And when Hushai, in verse 6, was come to Absalom, Absalom spoke unto him, saying, "Ahithophel has spoken after this manner. What do you think we should do?" And in verse 7, Hushai said unto Absalom, "The counsel that Ahithophel has given is not good at this time." That's pretty smart. If he just comes out and says, "Oh, no, I totally disagree. That's stupid." He's not going to win friends and influence people, right? But he comes out and he says, because remember, Hushai's goal is to protect David. So if he begins to look like the bad guy himself, or the one that's just stirring up trouble, it's not going to be as effective. So he starts off by saying, well, Ahithophel has a good idea, but it wouldn't work now. Oh, it's a great idea, but it's not the right plan for now. And so he's already trying to smooth over his own plan. Now in verse 8, "For," said Hushai, "you know that your father and his men, that they are mighty men, and they have chafed in their minds as a bear that is robbed of her whelps in the field. And thy father is a man of war, and he will not stay in one place with his people. Behold," in verse 9, "he is hid now in some pit or in some other place. It will come to pass that when some of them are overthrown at the first, that whosoever hears it will say, There's a slaughter among the people that follow Absalom. And he," in verse 10, "also that is valiant, whose heart is as the heart of a lion, will utterly melt." So he's saying, look, David's going to start to lose men, and then eventually even the valiant men will start to fall off. And continuing in verse 10, "For all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and they which be with him are valiant men. Therefore, this is my counsel," in verse 11. "I counsel that all Israel be generally gathered unto you from Dan to Beersheba." I think we just had that in trivia the other night, right? That from Dan to Beersheba means the whole country, from north to south. "Everybody should be gathered unto you, as the sand that is by the sea for multitude, and that you go to battle in your own person. So shall we come upon him in some place where he shall be found, and we will light upon him as the dew falls on the ground. And of him and of all the men that are with him, there shall not be left as one. Moreover," in verse 13, we're just going to read 2 more verses. In verse 13, "Moreover, if he is gotten into a city, then shall all Israel bring ropes into that city, and we shall draw it into the river until there be not one stone left found there. And Absalom," in verse 14, "and all the men of Israel said, the counsel of Hushai the Archite is even better than the counsel of Ahithophel. For the Lord has appointed to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, to the intent that the Lord might bring evil upon Absalom." So it worked. Hushai's plan wins the mind and heart of of Absalom. And so they're going to go with Hushai's plan, which, now, generally speaking, Ahithophel's plan is simply that we got to go after David now, before he gets stronger. And Hushai's plan is generally this. No, David is like a wounded bear right now. He's actually more dangerous right now. You need to just wait, and he'll get weaker over time. Which Hushai knows that he's saying this because his plan will help David, right? And Absalom agrees with Hushai. I love it. So you think about Hushai's methods here of showing his loyalty to David. And his methods are all tactical methods. It's all about using his brain to help show loyalty by convincing others either to do good or trying to convince others to not do evil. And so this is one of the methods that maybe God's equipped you with for how you can show your loyalty to your king. Maybe you're the tactician and the one that's coming up with a plan of how you can convince people. No, let's not sin. Let's do this. Or let's go after God and serve him in holiness and righteousness. So that is the type of person that this Hushai is. And he's willing to even put himself in the palace with Absalom, putting himself at risk to be ready to be used. There are some people that they'll take jobs, they'll go to schools and colleges that are hostile to the Lord because they're willing to be a Hushai. They're prepared in their heart to be standing on the solid, firm ground of the Word of God. They know God, and they're ready to say, I'm going to go be a Hushai. I'm going to go stand in that college, and I'm going to prevent people from doing evil, and I'm going to encourage people into godliness. I'm going to intellectually try to help people and reason with people. If that's you, you're a Hushai. And we need people like that. We need people that will show loyalty to God in that way. But if that's not you, that's okay. Not everybody has to be the intellectual. Is that good? Does that sound good? Not everybody has to be the intellectual. You can turn your brain off sometimes. We're going to find more people in this chapter that are not the intellectuals. They have other skill sets in which they show their loyalty to the king. So let's continue and let's look at some of them. So verse 15, it says here that when Hushai, then said Hushai unto Zadok and to Abiathar the priests. I want to remind you who they are, because if you remember back in chapter, it was chapter 15, I believe, it was last week's session. David also not just sent Hushai back to the palace, David also sent these priests back to the palace and said, hey, look, you're priests. Absalom's not going to give you a hard time. Go back to the palace and see what you can do to support me back at the palace. So Hushai has friends here at the palace that are also loyal to David. And we've got Zadok and Abiathar the priests, and we're also going to find that these two priests' sons are there. And so now we have Hushai talking to these priests here in verse 15. Hushai said to them, thus and thus did Ahithophel counsel, Absalom and the elders of Israel, and thus have I counseled. Now therefore send quickly and go tell David, saying, don't lodge this night in the plains of the wilderness, but speedily pass over. Keep going. lest the king be swallowed up and all of the people that are with him. And in verse 17, now Jonathan and Ahimaaz, which are the sons of the priests, these are loyal men to David, Jonathan and Ahimaaz stayed by Enrogel, for they might not be seen to come into the city, and here's another King James word, and a wench, meaning a female servant. A female servant went and told them, and they went and told David. So David's spies, through the kind of the grapevine, they get word back to David that David should not stay there, but that he needs to continue to move on and get out of there even further. So here we have these priest sons, and we even have this other lady, this young woman servant here, and they're all kind of relaying this message to David. And it just kind of reminds me that there are people that we will hardly know much about. Just kind of covert, just doing the job on the down low. They're quietly just showing their loyalty to the king. And they're undercover. We don't even know this young girl's name. Some young servant girl, and she relays the message, and she helps, and she shows her loyalty. It just kind of reminds me that she just takes what she has. Oh, I can relay a message, and she does that, and she helps. She puts herself at risk of being found out to show her loyalty to King David. You don't always have to be the brightest light bulb in the room that's going to be in the palace, like trying to trick Absalom, and trying to convince people to come to Christ. You can just be the girl that is like, oh, you need me to relay a message? Yeah, I could do that. And they're just these background people, but nevertheless, they do what's called upon them to do. And I love that. I love that it takes all kinds of people. We don't have to become something different. Just use who we are to serve the Lord, right? And we continue here in verse 18. Nevertheless, a lad saw them. And this young man told Absalom. So now we know this young lad and who he's loyal to. But they went, both of them, away quickly and came to a man's house in Baharim, which had a well in his court, where they went down. And the woman took and spread a covering over the well's mouth and spread ground corn thereupon, and the thing was not known. So this woman, she hides these two priests' sons, Jonathan and Ahimaaz. She hides them under this well and covers it up. And in verse 20, and when Absalom's servants came to the woman to the house, they said, where is Ahimaaz and Jonathan? And the woman said to them, oh, they've already gone over the brook of water. They've already left. And when they had sought and could not find them, they returned back to Absalom at Jerusalem. So here we have this man and this woman here in the city of Baharim who hide the loyal subjects of David, Jonathan and Ahimaaz, and they hide them in this well and they cover it up. You think they planned for that night? Like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? We're going to, no, they didn't plan it, is my point. This came upon them, and they had to make a decision. They had to decide on what to do. And sometimes that's going to happen to us. Sometimes we have to show loyalty to our King Jesus in a spur of the moment where you don't have time to plan it. I mean, they didn't have time to plan this. They're like, oh man, Jonathan and Ahimaaz are here, and these guys are coming from the palace. Hide, And they decided to do that. They took a risk. Have you noticed a theme here that in every one of the people that are showing loyalty to David, they have to take a risk. There's a certain element of personal potential of loss. And so they spontaneously decide to help. And sometimes that's how loyalty shows up. You feel like you never really get an opportunity to do anything for the Lord. Well, the Lord doesn't even know my name. And then all of a sudden, one day, somebody's standing in front of you mocking Jesus Christ. And you get to be the one to say, hey, don't say that. And you get to step up and you get to say something, or you get to encourage somebody. And you get to show your loyalty, and you get to show whose side you're on. And so sometimes don't expect that it's always going to be exactly how you plan it. Sometimes you're going to be this man and woman like, what do we do? Put them in the well and cover it up. I don't know. And because you know whose side you're on. You're already loyal and you're prepared to help out whenever the Lord would call upon you. So continuing to verse 21, it came to pass after that they departed that they came up out of the well, and they went and they told King David, and said unto David, arise and pass over the brook of water, for thus hath Ahithophel counseled against you. In verse 22, then David arose, and all the people that were with him, and they passed over Jordan by the morning light. There lacked none, not one of them, that was not gone over the Jordan River. So these priests' sons that had to be hidden, they finally get to David, and they say, David, you need to keep fleeing. You need to keep going further beyond the Jordan River. And they do that. Now, in verse 23, we're going to flash back to the palace for just a second. We got to finish the story of Ahithophel. Ahithophel, this old man, this guy that is so used to being looked at as, I'm awesome. If I speak, it might as well be the voice of God. Okay? But Ahithophel was just defeated when Hushai's counsel was taken by Absalom instead of his. And look what happens in verse 23. Verse 23, when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey and arose and went to his house to his city, and he put his household in order, and he hanged himself, and he died. And he was buried in the sepulcher of his father. Now, I don't want you to think about that this is a suicide because he had, some kind of hurt feelings. This isn't like he took Hushai's plan, I've got hurt feelings. It's way beyond that. This is Ahithophel killing himself because he knows that because his counsel was not followed, David will rise back up to power, and David will strengthen himself, and David will come back. And when David comes back, he will be kicked out, right? He knows that. And so that's why he hangs himself, because he knows that his life is over. When the king comes back, he's done anyway. So he wants to, even in death, he has to take things into his own hands. He doesn't want David to come back and he doesn't want to face judgment at the hands of David. He takes matters into his own hands. He's like, well, they didn't listen to me, so David's going to come back into power, and when he comes back, he's going to kill me, so I'm just going to end it myself. That is ultimate pride. Ultimate pride. I mean, this guy is all forms of earthly smart, but he's just spiritually as blind as can be. He's just a spiritual fool. He knows all the tactician work. He knows all of the strategies, and he knows he's going to lose right now, but he's spiritually blind and not willing to repent, even now at this stage in life. He used his intellectual methods for self-advancement, and when he knew it would fail, he bailed. And he just quits. Oh, they didn't listen to me. David's going to come kill me, so I might as well end it myself. I mean, what pride? What pride? Even in this moment, he can't bend the knee and say, oh, I need to get right with my king and with my God. And he's not willing to do it. And so in verse 24, now we're back over to David in the wilderness in verse 24. Then David came to Mahanaim, and Absalom passed over Jordan, he and all his men of Israel with him. And Absalom made Amasa captain of the hosts instead of Joab, because Joab is over with David. Which Amasa was a man's son, whose name was Ithra, an Israelite, that went in to Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. So Israel and Absalom pitched in the land of Gilead. Now all of this is simply just to set up this man Amasa for later. So Amasa is being set up as a general of Absalom's. Okay, and so we get his background here a little bit, and we'll deal with Amasa later. But he's giving here just to kind of set him up so we can know who he is for later. He's now become one of Absalom's generals. In verse 27, it came to pass when David was come to Mahanaim that Shobiah, now look at these people we're introduced to. Shobai, the son of Nahash of Rabbah, of the children of Ammon, and Machir, the son of this guy of Lodabar, and also Barzillai, who's a Gileadite of Rogelim, they brought beds and basins and earthen vessels and wheat and barley and flour and parched corn and beans and lentils and parched pulse, honey and butter. It goes on and on. All this stuff. sheep and cheese and cows for David and for the people that were with him to eat. For they said, the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. They came there to where David was with all of this stuff. They weren't there. They came there. At personal cost to themselves, at losing their income back home. We got to take all this stuff to David. That's loyalty. That is another kind of loyalty. David finds great comfort in these three men that come. Shobai, Barzillai, and who's the other one? I want to say his name. What a great guy. And Machir. They come to David and his men. They bring all this stuff to physically and tangibly sustain them and help them. Have you ever had somebody do that? Somebody that just shows up at your house with some physical, tangible blessing. Here, do you need this? That's these guys. This is a complete other type of loyalty, right? Their method of showing loyalty is material support. I mean, again, some people are the Hushays in the palace, like using their brain to help you out and fix things for you. And then some people are just that guy that shows up and says, here, take this. You know, and God gifts us all in different ways. And don't be ashamed to be who you are, who God's made you into. You know, if you're not the person that's got a lot of money to give gifts and helps like these guys, then don't. Be who you are. Be who God's made you into be. Use the loyalty God's given you to give. Maybe it's your brain, maybe it's your muscles, maybe it's your money, maybe, whatever. There's many different forms of loyalty shown here. And for some, like these guys, it's gifts. It's help in that very, very tangible way. And I believe for all of us, we'll end up being all of these things at different times in life. You could probably think of a time in life where you were each of these things. You were the one that came up with the plan, or you were the one that helped out, or you were the ones that physically did the work. You know, there's lots of different ways to show your loyalty and support. And so find out who God's made you into and go do that. Show your loyalty to the Lord in that way. And now, verse 18. This is the end of the story of Absalom, really, here in chapter 18. In chapter 18. And it's the end of this whole trouble that David had. We set up these first three chapters as the sins of omission, things that David didn't do that he should have. And now we're talking about how David is carried through this valley of his life by these men, these loyal men helping him out all along the way. And in chapter 18, there's a significant event where somebody comes along and helps David out in a way that David would not have even done for himself. Absalom needs to be dealt with. And David's not willing to do it. And there's somebody else that is. And that's loyalty. Somebody that's willing to do the hard job that you don't have the gut to do. You don't have the stomach to do it. You don't have the willpower to do it. And a friend comes along and says, I'll do it for you. Let me do it. You ever had a moment where maybe you're grieving the loss of something, and you don't have the strength, you don't have the power to go, maybe you've lost somebody that lived in your house. You don't have the strength to go clean up their stuff and put it away. And somebody comes to your house and says, let me go do it for you. I'll do it. I know you can't do it. Let me do it for you. They do what you don't have the ability to do. David is in this place where because of his own sin, he doesn't have the ability to bring Absalom to justice. And he's going to have somebody that comes along and says, David, I'm going to do it for you. I am going to do for you, because of my loyalty for you, I'm going to do for you what you can't do for yourself. And that's what happens in chapter 18. It's sort of, I want to kind of present it as the limits of loyalty. Loyalty will go beyond even what you want. If you say, no, I just can't, I don't want you to do that. But yet, if you know it's the right thing to do, you might go do it anyway. Because you're like, I know they don't want it done, but it's the right thing to do and it's going to help them. I'm going to go do it for them. And so loyalty has its limits, where you will even break what they want if there's something better that they need. And we're going to see Joab does that in chapter 18. Let's pick it up here in verse 1, chapter 18. David numbered the people that were with him and set captains over thousands and captains over hundreds. Now all these people have gathered to David, just like Hushai lied about. And David sent forth a third part of the people under the hand of Joab, and a third part of the people under Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, and who was Joab's brother. And a third part he put under the hand of Ittai, the Gittite. The Gittite means he was from Gath. This guy's a Philistine. And the king said unto the people, I will surely go forth with you myself also. But the people answered and said, you shall not go forth with us, David, for if we flee away, they will not care for us. Neither if half of us die will they care for us. But now you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore now it is better that you support us or help us get out of the city. And David said unto them in verse 4, okay, whatever seems good to you, I'll do. And the king stood by the gate side, and all the people came out by the hundreds and by the thousands. And the king commanded Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, deal gently for my sake with my young man. He's talking about Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave all the captains charge concerning Absalom. So David divides all of his people into these three groups, these three armies, and he puts Ittai as a new general in charge of a third of his army. And I love that. I mean, this Ittai, we were talking about loyalty tonight, right? This Ittai, you remember when David was in the Philistine territories running from Saul? He picked up men of Philistine men that were loyal to him. And here's one that's still loyal to him after all these years. This Philistine is even willing to leave Jerusalem knowing Absalom's chasing him, and he's still loyal to David. And he's risen to the rank of being one of David's most trusted men. I just love that. There's such loyalty in this man, Ittai. No, but notice, here's the key part of what we just read. Notice that David said in verse 5, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. David is still encumbered in his own heart that he cannot deal with Absalom. He is not willing to bring Absalom under justice like he needs to be brought under for all of the sin that and the way he has led the whole nation into sin. And David is still not there in his heart. He's still not ready to bring justice to his own kids. And that might be one of the hardest things any of us would ever have to do in our lives. To have to say, I can't let you go any further. You have to get this right. I cannot let you continue in this sin. And David's not willing to do that. And now in verse 6, so the people went into the field against Israel, and the battle was in the wood of Ephraim. There is now a big battle. Absalom's forces are coming out, David's forces are coming over, and they all begin to fight in the woods of Ephraim. And in verse 7, when the people of Israel were slain before the servants of David, and there was a great slaughter that day, 20,000 men died. In verse 8, for the battle was there scattered over the face of the whole country, and the wood devoured more people that day than the sword did. Wow. Because you got to figure armies are not used to marching through wooded areas, right? And so they're getting beat up by the trees and stumbling and falling off cliffs and all kinds of trouble just because of the territory that they're in, even more than being stabbed by other swords and arrows. In verse 9, Absalom met the servants of David, and Absalom rode upon his mule, and the mule went under a thick bough of great oak trees, and his head caught hold on the oak, and he was taken up between heaven and earth, and the mule that was under him went away. And a certain man saw it, and he told Joab and said, behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree. And if you remember, this explains why just a few chapters ago the Word of God told us that Absalom had long, beautiful, thick hair. Every year he cut it, it weighed 6 pounds when he cut off. That's why it told us that story, because it helps make sense out of this, that he actually got it stuck in the tree as he's riding through, and he's caught, and he can't get it out. And so he's stuck there in the tree, trying to wiggle his way out. Some of David's men in verse 10 see him hanging in the tree, and they tell David's general Joab, hey, I just saw Absalom hanging in the tree. And so, isn't this interesting how Absalom has this great, do you remember the last couple of chapters we read last time we were together? This great, detailed plan that Absalom had about how, I'm going to go down to Hebron and I'm going to start winning the hearts of the men over to me and away from David. And, Absalom had this plan, right? Remember? It wasn't just like he showed up one day and said, I think I should be king instead of you. No. He had this plan. He was slowly trying to win the hearts of people, and it took time. And then finally one day he gathered certain people, went to Hebron and announced that, it was an elaborate thing, right? And then all of a sudden, one day, he gets stuck in a tree and he's going to die for his treachery. I just think that is some of the most amazing things in the Word of God. How, the Word of God says that we plan our ways, but it's the Lord that directs his steps. We can do all the planning in the world, but it's going to go the way the Lord wants it to go. So I get it. There's an advantage to planning and shoot for goals in your life, but you have to expect the Lord's going to do whatever he's going to do, especially when it comes to the enemies of God. And so with all of Absalom's intricate planning and strategy on how he's going to take over the kingdom of Israel and then take out David and he's going to be the king, it all comes to the end because of something that seems like such a complete random act. He just gets stuck in a tree. It's not random at all. God's hand is in it. And it just reminds me that at any given moment, God can just take your enemy and say, stay right there. Hang on just a second. You're done. At any moment, God could just intervene and change things and say, no more. Stay right there. Let me just hold you for a second. And he's done. This is going to be his end, right? Right here. This is his downfall. Now, verse 11. So one of the soldiers sees Absalom hanging there and goes and tells David's general Joab, right? So in verse 11, Joab said to the man that told him, and behold, thou sawest him. Why didn't you kill him when you saw him? And I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a girdle. And the man said unto Joab, though I should receive 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, yet would I not put forth my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king charged both you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, beware that no one touches the young man Absalom. So this soldier boy says, whoa, the king said to treat him gentle, like don't kill him. That's why I didn't do it. And so in verse 13, otherwise I should have wrought falsehood against my own life, this soldier says. For there is no matter hid from the king, and thou thyself wouldst have set thyself against me. He's saying, why are you putting yourself against me, Joab? Or he's saying, if I would have killed Absalom, you, Joab, would have come against me because I disobeyed the king. So this young soldier explains why he didn't kill Absalom. It's because this is what David's request was. But every time somebody in authority makes a request, it doesn't mean it's a godly one. And David made this request to treat Absalom nicely, and that wasn't the right request. David should not have said that. This man, this young soldier, is an example of somebody that's not able to make the hard decision. Look, I know David said it's his request that we don't harm Absalom, but that's not good. That's not healthy. That's not godly. That's not right. Absalom has to come to justice. He's leading everybody astray, the whole nation. And this young soldier wasn't able to make that hard decision to disobey the king's request. Now, let's see what happens now in verse 14. Then said Joab, I may not tarry thus with thee. And he took 3 darts in his hand, and he thrust them through the heart of Absalom, while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak tree, hanging there. And in verse 15, 10 young men that bore Joab's armor compassed about and smote Absalom and slew him. And Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab held back the people. And they took Absalom and cast him into a great pit in the wood. And they laid a very great heap of stones upon him, and all Israel fled, every one to his tent. So the battle is over. So Joab does what David couldn't do. David did not have the heart to do it. He brought justice to this situation. this was the right thing to do. I mean, we could go on and on about all of the laws of Moses that Absalom has violated, but put on top of it all that what Absalom has violated is the very promises of God. What were the promises of God to Abraham? I will give you a nation. I will give you a lineage to bring a Messiah, right? And Absalom is interfering with God's very promises to bring the Messiah through David. And this is a capital offense. This isn't a time for grace. That Absalom is interfering with God's will. In this dispensation, God's plan is focused around Israel, and Absalom is rebelling against the very heart of what God is trying to do. So Joab was correct here in believing that David is better with Absalom dead. However, it's not without sin that Joab kills Absalom here, because David, his authority, told him to not do this. But loyalty will make the hard decisions because it's right, it's helpful. It will be the better thing that you need. It will be what's right. Absalom needed to be brought to justice, and he knew David would never do that. He knew David had a sinful soft spot, that he would never do that. You know, Jesus did that same thing for us. Not that Jesus had a sinful soft spot. Jesus did for us what we wouldn't do for ourselves. We had no way to fix ourselves. And yet Jesus said, you know what? I'm going to do for them what they can't do for themselves. I'm going to go die on the cross for them, for us, for me. And he did for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. And that's the same idea here, Joab. Joab's saying, I'm going to do for David what he can't do for himself. I'm going to bring Absalom to justice. And he does. He does, because that's what's right. But David could not bring himself to do it. We couldn't bring ourselves to save ourselves because we don't have the ability. David couldn't bring himself to save himself from Absalom because he had that sinful soft spot. And in both cases, Joab here's a picture of Jesus saying, I'm going to do for you what you can't do for yourself. That's how much I love you. That's how much I'm in relationship with you. That's how much I'm loyal to you. That I will do this for you, even though it's hard to do. And in verse 18, I just want to continue. Now Absalom, in his lifetime, had taken and reared up for himself a pillar which is in the king's dale, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. And he called the pillar after his own name, and it was called unto this day Absalom's place. So Absalom didn't have a son. He expected to die without a king after him, but yet he had this place that he had set up. And isn't this interesting? You'd expect a self-centered man like Absalom to promote himself even in death instead of promoting God. And that's exactly what he does. He sets up this place called Absalom's place, and it's still there, even up until the time where this book was written. And so Absalom was never looking to be loyal to God, to support God, to emphasize God. Even in death, he's still promoting himself. How sad. And now in verse 19, then said Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, let me now run and bear the king tidings, how that the Lord hath avenged him of his enemies. So Ahimaaz, the priest's son, wants to go to David. And Joab, in verse 20, said to him, no, don't go. You shall not bear tidings this day, but thou shalt bear tidings another day. But this day thou shalt bear no tidings, because the king's son is dead. Then said Joab to Cushai, a different messenger, go tell the king what you have seen. And Cushai bowed himself unto Joab and ran. I just want you to understand that there's a period of time that happens there. So he said to Ahimaaz, don't go tell David today that Absalom died today. Because he knew that Ahimaaz was somebody that David trusted as a priest, and that he would expect good news out of Ahimaaz. But someday in the future, he sends in verse 21 another messenger named Cushai. That as David would see this messenger coming, he wouldn't know what the message was going to be. Well, Cushai, I don't know what he's going to tell me. But you see now in verse 22 that just after Cushai is sent to David, verse 22 says, then said Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, yet again to Joab, but howsoever let me, I pray thee, also run after Cushai. And Joab said, why will you run, my son, seeing that thou hast no tidings ready? But howsoever he said, let me run. And he said unto him, okay, go ahead, run. Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and overran Cushai. So Ahimaaz came back to Joab and said, can I go today? And finally, Joab's like, all right, fine, go ahead and go tell him. He's thinking Cushai already has enough of a lead that he'll get to David first. But it tells us at the end of verse 23 that Ahimaaz actually got to David first with the message. So that's where we pick it up here in verse 24. David sat between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof over the gate of the wall and lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man ran alone. And the watchman cried and told the king, and the king said, if he be alone, then there is tidings in his mouth. Meaning, okay, he's a messenger. And he came apace and drew near, and the watchman said, another man's coming. The watchman called unto the porter and said, behold, another man is running alone, meaning it's a messenger. And the king said, he also is bringing a message. And the watchman in verse 27 said, I think the running of the first man is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. And the king said, oh, then it's a good message. He's coming with good news. And that's exactly what Joab was concerned about. That if Ahimaaz got there first, that David would think that Absalom's still alive and things are going well. So David is assuming that Ahimaaz has good news. And let's finish this off in verse 28. Ahimaaz called and said unto the king, all is well. And he fell down to the earth upon his face before the king and said, blessed be the Lord thy God, which has delivered up the men that lifted up their hand against my lord the king. And King David said, is the young man Absalom safe? And Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent me, thy servant, I saw a great tumult, but I don't know what it was. And the king said unto him, turn aside and stand here. And he turned aside and stood there. So Ahimaaz copped out, and he didn't tell him the whole story. He didn't tell him that he knew Absalom was dead. He didn't have the heart to do it. He didn't have the heart to do it. It's the same problem David has. He doesn't have the heart just to say and do the hard truth. Just say it. Just do it. Whatever the truth is, just admit it. You can't change the truth by avoiding it, right? This is foolish of Ahimaaz to not just say it. And we'll find that out here in verse 31. And behold, Cushai, the second messenger, right? Cushai came, and he said, tidings, my lord the king, for the Lord hath avenged thee this day of all them that rose up against you. And the king said unto Cushai, is the young man Absalom safe? And Cushai answered, the enemies of my lord the king, and all that rise against thee to do thee harm, be as that young man is. Meaning, yes, he's dead. Yes, he's dead. Ahimaaz tried to spare David, and here comes Cushai right on his heels, and he arrives and he gives it away anyway. I really believe that the purpose that the Lord had in putting these stories in the Word of God for you and I today, you read this and you're like, well, Ahimaaz came and told half the story, which he held back from David the truth of the matter, and then right on his heels, Cushai comes and says the whole matter anyway. David finds out that Absalom's dead anyway. What good was it that Ahimaaz held back? I think that's the exact reason it's in the Word of God. It's trying to make the point to us that it does no good to try to avoid the truth. It does no good to try to deal lightly with Absalom. You have to deal with the problem. You have to say the truth. You have to do the truth. You can't avoid it. And that's exactly the point here of the two runners. Cushai comes right on his heel and says, yeah, he's dead. You just feel like David's looking back at Ahimaaz like, you didn't know this? It's deceptive. It's deceptive. And it does no good. It does no good. You have to face it. We think about the limits of loyalty in this chapter and how Joab was willing to step up and do it. He went beyond what some people thought would be the limit of loyalty, and he did what he needed to do because it was right. And that's the same here with Cushai. He spoke what was true and what was right. What good is a messenger if they're not speaking the truth? And that's the problem with Ahimaaz here. He doesn't just say it. Just give me just the fact, right? Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am. It doesn't matter if it hurts your feelings. You have to know the truth. And that's important. That's important to show loyalty, is to just say and do the truth. And then finally here in verse 33, it says that the king was much moved, and he went up to the chamber over the gate, and he wept. And as he went, thus he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son." And so we see David mourning with heartfelt emotion. And again, it's just this reminder that David is still encumbered with this soft spot to not deal with these things in his life. And he never did. And Joab had to do it for him. And you have to remember, this is a time period in David's life. We're not praising him for these things. He's gotten himself into this situation because he committed his own sin with Bathsheba and with Uriah and lying and all the other things, and he kept going and going. And then he had this family, and he's raising these teenagers, and he's raising these 20-year-olds, and he never corrected them on the same problems he had. And then here he is weeping because one of them is this far off track that he ends up facing judgment. And he's still weeping like, I can't believe this happened. I can't believe this happened. It happened because you didn't bring him justice when he was the 1-year-old, when he was the 2-year-old, when he was the 4-year-old beating on people, when he was the 6-year-old, when he was the 12-year-old. You have to bring justice at every appropriate step so you don't face this. And here we have David mourning this. And it's almost a mourning of his own loss as much as it's a loss of Absalom because of what he put into Absalom, or should I say what he didn't put into Absalom. So you think of all the people that we just read about, from these 3 people that brought all the material support. You think of Hushai, you think of Joab doing the dirty work. All of these people that showed their loyalty to David. And we can learn a lot, I really believe, from these chapters about what it means to be loyal to our King, to King Jesus, right? Being loyal to our friends, being loyal to our churches, being loyal to the people that God's put in our lives. Think about what motivates us to support, other people. What motivates us? It really should be not self-gain like Ziba, but it should be a desire just to be there with each other. And we're going to see that more with Mephibosheth next time in chapter 19. That it's all about, I just want to be with you. And we see that relationship being drawn out. But don't be motivated by snap decisions from emotion. But, be like Hushai, where you think about what you're doing. You get engaged. You use your mind or other means. Maybe you do whatever it takes to support and help the godly. And we saw that all through chapter 16. And then we think about how has God crafted us to be loyal? In what very practical way has God gifted us to be loyal? Maybe you're the tactician that uses your brain. Maybe you're the quiet, covert, helper. Some people are gifted in that way to show their loyalty. But others have to do it in a very spontaneous way. Be ready to just jump in at the drop of a hat. And then we see others yet that are just gifted with money and the ability to support in that very tangible way with gifts or help or food or whatever. And so it's different for everybody. And just let the Lord draw that out of you on how you are gifted to help the church and support the Lord, be loyal to the Lord. But finally, you got to know your limits. A true loyalist will have a limit. They're not going to be loyal to somebody when they say, I don't want you to do X, Y, and Z. And it's wrong for them. You won't obey that. You have to know your limit. That's not loyal if you just obey some ungodly direction by somebody. And Joab knew that about David, that he had to get involved. He's willing to make the hard decisions, right? Meaning he had to go against what David wanted because he knew what David was requesting wasn't good. Even at great cost to himself, at a potential great cost. We're going to find out in chapter 19. Joab is going to stand before David, and David's going to say, why did you do this? Joab took a great risk at doing for David what he couldn't do for himself. And I tell you that I just want to make sure you see Jesus Christ in that, because God showed his loyalty for us in giving up his own son to come here for us and do for us what we couldn't do. And now let us just show our loyalty back to him for the great loyalty and relationship that he's shown to us. So, I pray even in these Old Testament chapters of King David that you really see how these principles were placed here by God for us to learn. These principles of what it means to be loyal and help out and truly use the gifts that God's given to us to serve Jesus Christ even today. Right? Yeah, amen.